I wanted to talk about the characters in this book because they have, it seems, an additional dimension that your characters have not previously had. First of all, they have a nostalgia that is not just cultural but personal, and they are missing each other in ways that the characters haven't before. It's a very odd thing to me. David Foster Wallace called me up when he was reading the book and said, Don DeLillo has considerable sentiment toward these Bronx mafiosi. And I think he was surprised and felt that you had earned it, too. Was sentiment a source of fear for you?
I don't know that I'd call it sentiment. I do know that I did feel something more deeply than I had before. And I suppose it's largely a question of perspective. When I first started writing short fiction, these stories were set in that particular landscape, in the Bronx in which I'd grown up. I wasn't very adept as a writer, and my life changed in certain ways. The environment grew larger, and I tried to write about the broader culture. It's probably no coincidence that my first novel was called Americana. Moving back to that terrain, to that landscape, decades later, gave me first an enormous sense of pleasure, the pleasure of recollection, largely. And as well, it seemed to deepen the feeling I have toward the characters in that part of the book, in large part because they seemed in my mind to be so closely associated to people I actually knew. There were friends I grew up with who were not literally figures in the novel, but who nonetheless inhabited. And I think this is largely the cause of a somewhat more intense feeling I tended to exhibit.
One of the earlier novels was dedicated to the boys of, what was the number?
To the boys at 607, three male cousins I grew up with, and that was the house address where we lived. And there are probably a couple of references in Underworld to this house and to these three guys.
What I found as I was reading, now your listeners are listening to someone who spent the last 10 days staying up till 4 o'clock in the morning reading Underworld. By the conclusion, it's an exalting and exhilarating experience. But as a result, when you read something intensely, intensely, certain completes occur, and I began to get a merged or fused picture of a basic family unit. Not any single one, but almost as if they were plastic slides and laid on each other. A husband and wife, an act of infidelity. This is the teacher and Clara, and then Brian Glassick, who sleeps with Nick's wife. There seems to be a quintessential act of betrayal that's repeated throughout the book in different configurations, most of the time with a terrifying ennemi. The characters are saying, the reason why this has happened is I don't care. And it's almost as if there's a liberation moment. It's what starts to ungel the book. Nick can't help, he's not rejecting his friend, but he can't help but slapping him in the head. And it's as if a robot coming to care or feeling hurt enough to take this gesture seems to free the space at the end of the book for a host of miracles and connections. Am I making sense?
Well, it's almost as though the humans are acting against the author, in a way, acting against the book's thematic material, and lashing out at themselves, at each other, and maybe at on some level at their creator. There is a strong structural balance. There is an architecture to this book, and perhaps the people in it want to engage in a kind of palace rebellion in a curious sort of way.
Could you describe that architecture a bit? Because, for instance, similarly late at night, you know, when a book starts to come together in the mind, I remember Nick at a drug party thrown by the Rocket Heads. He's lying on the floor and he's forgetting what a shoe is. He's looking at a shoe. Several hundred pages in the book later, a teacher, a Jesuit, is sitting and going through in great detail the parts of shoes, the eyes and the tongue and the eyelid and the shaping of the leather. And it seems as if, you know, the book is held together by hundreds of cantilevered struts of this kind.
Well, this is how we began, talking a little bit about the coherence that art tries to impose on rough, unshaped experience. There are many levels of connection in this book. They kept suggesting themselves to me, and I think it all began in the prologue when the sports announcer Russ Hodges is announcing the dramatic home run. His voice travels through the ballpark and out beyond the ballpark, and suggests a level of human connectedness which continues throughout the novel. There is such a tight fabric of connection at some point that one could almost call it paranoid. And this is what happens to the character you've just been talking about, who has taken some sort of hallucinogenic substance and begins to study the shoe that someone is wearing, and believes that everyone around him is acting against his own best interests. There's a kind of interface between, in this book, between the real world and between the paranoid structures that people and institutions tend to build for themselves. The book itself is certainly not a paranoid structure. It merely registers the paranoia around it. And I think this element in the book culminates finally in cyberspace, when there is a series of nuclear explosions that suggests that here is finally the god of our suspicion, of our distrust, and of our ennemi.